Hello and welcome to The Point World Affairs. I'm Ta Sang-mi. The U.S., a major player in the denuclearization process of the Korean Peninsula, is facing an important midterm election this coming November. The results of this year's midterms could not only shape the future of Trump's presidency, but also shape the American political landscape for many years to come. Today, we'll discuss the various domestic issues and situations that the U.S. president faces and the impact these will have on the denuclearization negotiations on the Korean Peninsula. For that, we have with us here Mason Ricci, Professor of International Politics from Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Thank you for joining us.
Great, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Before we jump into the questions, let's take a look at the current political situation in the U.S.
President Donald Trump emerged as a strong candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize as he became the first U.S. commander-in-chief to sit down with his North Korean counterpart for the first time in history. But when it comes to domestic affairs, it's a different story. Trump's alleged ties with Russia has led to an independent counsel investigation, and despite repeated denials, calls for his impeachment have not ceased. His alleged sex scandal with a former porn star and the $130,000 that was handed over as hush money is also under scrutiny. What's more, he's been indicted by New York prosecutors on charges of illegally using his foundation's charity money to settle disputes involving his business empire, while his recent anti-immigration policies have drawn major criticism from both at home and abroad. In the midst of all these political scandals, experts say Trump is using his negotiations with North Korea to boost up his popularity once again ahead of the midterm elections scheduled for November. In fact, despite criticism from some political circles, many Americans have been positively evaluating Trump's meeting with Kim Jong-un and their talks on denuclearization. A survey released right after the meeting in June found that more than half of Americans believed nuclear threats have significantly been reduced after the summit. Riding this tide, Trump is emphasizing the outcome of the meeting, saying if it were not for him, the U.S. would already be at war with North Korea by now. With Trump spending more energy and resources on his talks with North Korea as a way to resolve the many domestic political challenges he faces, this week's episode will discuss how the current political landscape in the U.S. is set to impact the denuclearization talks.
Mason, so there are many issues on President Trump's agenda right now. So what kind of issues do you think will play well for him? And what kind of issues will actually be an adverse effect for his popularity?
Of course, Trump and his administration are facing two big upcoming results. One is going to be the results of the Mueller investigation into the Trump campaign and the relationship that it may or may not have had with Putin's Russia during the last presidential campaign. The other big issue that will have a major result coming up soon will be the midterm elections in November later this year. I think Trump has largely neutralized, at least politically speaking, the Mueller investigation. He's politicized it. He has, I think, taken off the table a chance of impeachment coming out of the results of this, unless there's just some obvious smoking gun that up until now we haven't seen and don't expect to see. The midterm elections are a different story, of course. A betting person would probably guess that the Democrats would win at least the House. The chance of taking over the Senate by the Democrats is, of course, much lower. And really, I think what's going to determine the outcome of that are a few major issues. On the positive side for Trump, he has his nomination now for the Supreme Court, Brett Kavanaugh, and it's entirely possible that the nomination process for Kavanaugh will end up motivating Trump's supporters to come out and vote in November. The other positive, of course, is the economy, which is doing comparatively well, both in terms of unemployment, slightly rising wages, a sort of general overall positive sentiment about the economy, the markets as well. So that plays obviously to his favor. On the negative side, the immigration issue, at least among many people in the United States, in the center and the left of the political spectrum, continues to be something that is a problem for them. It's also the case that some of the results of the Mueller investigation may also bring some of those voters to the polls. And we know that midterm elections, in terms of outcome, are driven primarily by turnout. And so really the question is which of the two parties, the Republican or the Democratic Party, will manage to motivate the largest percentage of their supporters to come out. There is, of course, still time for Trump to push forward his party and perhaps to hang on to the House through some successes in the foreign policy realm. And the outcome of that for the moment is unknown. There's the way that Trump has handled his allies and whether or not that tones down a little bit and increases the overall sense that he's been a responsible manager of U.S. leadership. There are, of course, the trade issues, notably the escalating trade war with China and also to a lesser degree with Europe. And then, of course, you have the North Korea dossier as well. And to the extent that he's able to book some successes, or at least claim to book some successes in North Korea, that's also going to bolster his chances of re-election. That being said, of course, typically foreign policy issues aren't so important in the midterm, so I think that those will be largely marginal.
As you said, there are so many agendas on his table right now, both domestically and internationally. Especially, you mentioned the nomination for the Supreme Court. It's a very important issue that was discussed. But we want to shift our attention a little bit towards North Korea. So President Trump's denuclearization process policy towards Pyongyang. So what do you think about that? Do you think it's more about hardliners versus softer tones towards Pyongyang rather than Democratic versus Republican? So what do you think about that?
That's true. There is a sense in which both on the Democratic and the Republican side of the partisan divide, there are hardliners and those who take a softer approach. I would actually say it's a bit more complicated than that. I think you actually have three groups. One that I think you might call the optimists. They're led by Trump himself. They are also led by Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, who's running point on the negotiations with North Korea over denuclearization. And their perspective is that North Korea can in fact be persuaded into denuclearizing over, for the moment, what is an unknown time frame. In exchange for lifting of sanctions, economic cooperation, reintegration of North Korea into the international community, improved ties and relations with the United States and South Korea. Then you have a second group, the warmongering chicken hawks, led by John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, also Lindsey Graham in the Senate. That group is, in some sense, subtly, I think, and in some cases not so subtly, undermining the diplomatic process and, frankly speaking, I think, attempting to accelerate its failure as a prelude to an attempt to convince Trump to take a much harder line approach up to and including a potential attack against North Korea. And then you have the third group, which I call the skeptical pragmatists. This group, perhaps led in some sense by Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, and many others, I think, whose names are less known to the general public. They believe that the big ambitious goals of complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement, what we call CVID, is unlikely, but also that attack is also a terrible option, and that we need to be aiming for arms control, deterrence, and containment instead of for ambitious goals either diplomatically or kinetically.
President Trump has been trying to resolve his domestic political challenges through denuclearization talks with North Korea. However, media outlets in the U.S. have been pouring out reports on Pyongyang's lack of a genuine intention to dismantle its nuclear missile programs. They say that Kim Jong-un has no real intentions of participating in a complete denuclearization process and that Pyongyang is hiding its facilities storing nuclear warheads. At this, some analysts say this is a political offensive against President Trump by leaking information that's false. In terms of the truth of the matter, experts have said that the alleged claim is not true. President Trump also criticized these reports as fake news. In the midst of this controversy, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo made his third visit to North Korea early July. Although some media outlets and political circles have criticized his trip as being fruitless, Pompeo himself has said progress was made. After his meeting in Pyongyang, Pompeo made his first official trip to Tokyo to hold a three-way discussion with his Japanese and South Korean counterparts over North Korea's denuclearization and shared the commitment to the final, fully verified denuclearization of North Korea. President Trump himself has also expressed confidence in the success of the negotiations, saying Kim Jong-un will honor the contract that they signed in Singapore. President Trump is actively pursuing the success of these talks with Pyongyang ahead of the November midterm elections. With analysts reporting that the Republican Party solidarity and the gathering of its supporters have intensified in recent months, we talked to a local journalist and expert on this issue.
We now connect to the White House Bureau Chief of VOA News, Steve Herman, to get the local public opinion in the U.S. Welcome, Steve.
Hello, Sang-mi.
Hi, so has the White House officially announced the results of U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's third visit to North Korea?
There's been no reaction from here at the White House. There hasn't been a news conference, and President Trump hasn't been commenting on it. But it's been up to the State Department and Secretary Pompeo to push back on these reports and the North Korean comments that things didn't go all too well in Pyongyang. And they're asserting that things are still very much on track, that they're confident that North Korea will agree to a full denuclearization, and they're talking about future discussions.
Right, Steve. Despite the positive outlook, there were some reports from the North Korean state news agency where they said that the meeting with Pompeo was a little bit regrettable. So what's your take on that?
Well, I don't think it really came as any surprise to anyone here at the White House or those who follow North Korea from afar that there would be some sort of pushback from Pyongyang. This is a long, true and tried negotiating tactic of the North Koreans. And if you parse the statement that they put out, they tend to put the blame on Secretary Pompeo and those who showed up with him, and leaving room open for there to be further discussions with President Trump. And they were careful not to criticize President Trump in their statement.
From the U.S.-North Korea summit to the third visit of Mike Pompeo to Pyongyang, there has been a lot of developments. So what are the responses or reactions from the media outlets in the U.S. and politicians?
Well, I think it depends on where both media outlets and politicians fall on the political spectrum. A lot of people saying, "I told you so." A lot of people believing that Trump came away with very little from that. He did tweet, the president, that is, about this, saying that he believes that Kim Jong-un will abide by the contract, as he called it, that they signed in Singapore.
Steve, how about the public opinion on this? Some reports said half the people in the U.S. believe that the nuclear threats will actually diminish after the summit. Did this really happen?
Well, I think a lot of people, even if they didn't support Donald Trump, were relieved that the rhetoric had gone from this rocket man fire and fury over to sitting down and kind words being exchanged between the president of the United States and someone that the president until very recently considered a belligerent. And there was a lot of concern that there could be a war. And the president himself was talking about tens of millions of people dying in Seoul and vicinity if there were to be a war. So that was a relief. That was very refreshing to a lot of people who didn't even support Donald Trump. I think his base the majority of them, that 30% or so of the U.S. Voting population, are going to have full faith and confidence in him no matter what he says or does. We've seen that on a lot of other issues. And then there was a smaller percentage willing to give the president a little bit of a doubt. And now there is increasing skepticism again, both among the public and some of the politicians and analysts who said, "I told you so."
Thank you, Steve. Now let's connect to Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, Dean Chang, to get his analysis on the situation. Dean, good to have you on.
Hi, how are you?
There have been many reports in the U.S. stating that North Korea has no intention of dismantling its nuclear and missile programs. Why do you think there's recently been so much distrust regarding North Korea's promise to denuclearize?
Well, I think the distrust has to do with several things. One, North Korea has made many policy statements saying that it will not give up its nuclear weapons. North Korea has committed enormous resources to developing nuclear weapons, and we assume that those resources were spent with the intention of keeping them. And finally, North Korea has a very bad track record of breaking various promises. The Leap Day Agreement of several years ago may hold one of the world's records of being the shortest treaty compliance period for any nation. So North Korea has, particularly on nuclear weapons issues, violated the 1992 North-South Agreement between North and South Korea, as well as the 1994 agreed framework. So we have, unfortunately, a very long record of bad North Korean behavior.
There are a lot of hardliners in the Republican Party who are actually against the policies President Trump has towards North Korea. Are their opinions affecting President Trump?
Well, whether or not we choose to think of them as hardliners, these are folks who often look at North Korea with a reasonably jaundiced view for precisely the reasons we just said. North Korea has a very bad track record. Some of the things that are being talked about is a commitment on the part of Congress to wanting the U.S. to maintain forces in South Korea. This would presumably limit the president's negotiating positions about a trade-off between, say, North Korean nuclear weapons and American forces on the peninsula. Any kind of material benefits for North Korea, oil, trade, lifting of sanctions, almost certainly would require congressional support and approval as well. So if you cannot get enough Republicans and Democrats, and here it is bipartisan, to agree to do those things, then whatever the president promises, there's a limit to how much he can deliver.
So what do you think President Trump will do in the future in terms of this denuclearization process?
Well, I think that the president simply meeting with Kim Jong-un has made very clear that he is a different kind of president. It's interesting that the KCNA reporting on Mike Pompeo's visit highlighted the idea that this is a different president, this is a different approach. But at the end of the day, Mr. Trump is a businessman, so he is very good at negotiating. And the difference here is that he doesn't have to produce a deal. This isn't, in many ways, this is like his real estate deals. And the art of the deal, one of the points is be prepared to walk away. So North Korea has been very good at playing a very weak hand very well against the United States, against China, against Russia, against Japan, and against South Korea over the last 60 years. I think what Mr. Trump is trying to do is to say, all right, enough of that. Now I have a bigger bankroll. I have more chips. I have a bigger button, as he has said. I'm going to basically push you to see how far we can go, rather than letting you run the table.
I see. Thank you, too, for your insights. That has been Steve Herman from VOA News and Dean Chang from the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. Right, so how do you evaluate what Steve has said about the public opinion in the U.S. and the political landscape?
Largely, he's correct. I guess I would add, one thing, which is, to the extent that the U.S. public is relieved that we're not going to war with North Korea, that shows, unfortunately, I think that the U.S. voting public and non-voting public has a very short memory, because in many senses it was Trump who ginned up this sense of conflict in the first place, hopefully, primarily as a negotiating tactic and not something that he actually intended to carry out. I think he's also right, Mr. Herman, that indeed we have an incredibly polarized electorate right now, and indeed 30 to 35% of the U.S. population is going to support Trump more or less no matter what he does. Among the Democrats, there's also near unanimity in the distaste for Trump's approach to everything, including both domestic and foreign policy issues. In many senses, I think that Mr. Herman is largely correct. And then there's one other point that I think Mr. Chang was exactly correct about, and that is, to some degree, Mr. Trump doesn't have to make a deal. That's exactly correct. And it is entirely possible that the U.S. ends up, in some sense, walking away from the North Korea dossier in at least its current form. And that, interestingly, might lead to a situation where South Korea and China, for instance, end up having a lot more room to deal with North Korea in the way that they see fit. And this is something that is really only possible under a presidency like Trump. This would not have been possible for previous, more conventional Republicans, and it certainly wouldn't have been possible for Democrats, especially a Democratic president, who would have been considered soft on North Korea. So the fact that we have an unconventional Trump presidency means that, on the one hand, there's clearly a possibility that diplomatic breakdown could lead to kinetic conflict. We all hope that doesn't happen, of course. But it also means that there are other options that are open short of denuclearization, at least in the full form that we've seen the United States insist on in the past. And that may lead to limited success in terms of arms control, deterrence, and containment, or possibly South Korea and China being able to run point on North Korea in a way that would not have been possible previously.
There are so many rapid developments going on day by day, really. There are many speculations, as you laid out right now, even after the midterms in November. But to go back a little bit before we go to the midterms, do you think the Republican Party, who are actually opposed to the policies President Trump actually has towards denuclearization, would actually try to cooperate with him before the midterms?
Yes, almost certainly. I agree with Mr. Chang that ultimately you're going to have to get bipartisan support for any potential deal that Trump would make with North Korea. But I think that Trump is going to cross that bridge when he comes to it. And I think right now, as we've seen with Trump, he's willing to make extravagant promises, assuming that the Republicans will ultimately get behind him. And generally they have. And he's also tightened, I think, his control over the Republican Party significantly since the minor setbacks he had in 2017, for instance, involving Obamacare. And this is now Trump's Republican Party, and I don't see how we're going to suddenly see the rest of the Republicans grow a spine and actually defend what they previously believed when a Democratic president was in office, and they would have criticized the types of things that that Democratic president is doing, even though now it's a Republican president who's doing it. So I don't really think that you're going to get any pushback from the Republicans.
Do you think that the role of the U.S. will stay as important in terms of this process of denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula?
In the near to midterm, clearly the U.S. is going to be one of the primary actors here on the Korean Peninsula. We have seen, of course, Trump call into question and, in fact, end up canceling, or at least temporarily postponing U.S.-South Korea joint military exercises. We've also seen Trump on multiple occasions bring up the possibility of withdrawing troops either progressively or perhaps relatively quickly from the Korean Peninsula. This is a part of Trump's foreign policy, a sort of wavering isolationism that we don't typically see from Republican presidents. And in fact, the way that Trump has treated U.S. allies has reflected that. Trump has a worse relationship now with Angela Merkel of Germany, with Theresa May of Great Britain, and with other U.S. allies than he currently seems to have with Kim Jong-un, Xi Jinping, and Rodrigo Duterte, amazingly enough. So, to the extent that Trump ends up following some of those more isolationist tendencies that he has, we may end up in the long term perhaps seeing the U.S. role in Northeast Asia and the Korean Peninsula in general reduced. But in the near to midterm, I don't imagine that that's going to be the case.
Whether the role declines or not, let's just hope that the denuclearization would actually come on the Korean Peninsula.
I absolutely hope that that's the case, and with a little bit of luck and a little bit of hard work and a little bit of acumen, we may see some type of result short of CVID that actually ends up coming to pass. Let's certainly hope that's the case in any event.
Right. Thank you very much for your expertise today.
Right. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
That's all we have for today. Thank you for tuning in to The Point World Affairs, and we hope to see you again next week.